This is Let's Talk with Hart Hagen, and today I'm joined by my guests Rolf Fries and Vince Heiser. Rolf and Vince, how y'all doing?
Doing fine. This is Vince. Yep.
How's it going?
So we're going to talk about, I call it police violence and the protests. We're going to talk about protests and police violence against peaceful protesters, police violence against detainees, and anyway, Rolf, why don't you get us started? Let's talk about, what happened with Breonna Taylor and also George Floyd, and then go from there.
Okay. So I'll start with George Floyd since that was the first thing that happened. And that was in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We had 4 officers, including David Chauvin, basically execute George Floyd. He kept his knee on the neck of George Floyd for several minutes, about 7-8 minutes straight, until he was unconscious, pretty much choked him to death. And he had 2 other officers helping him keep him pinned down with knees on his side, knees on his legs, and a 4th officer who was standing there basically running interference for all the public that was there with their cell phone cameras, checking on him, asking for a pulse check. It never happened. And so with the death of George Floyd, that sparked everything else that's come since then. I mean, we did have Ahmaud Arbery before,
right? And
people were upset about that, but it was really the George Floyd situation that kicked everything off. So those 2 pretty much back to back, and then it comes home here with the Breonna Taylor incident. And she was a young lady, 26 years old, EMT, who was gunned down in her home by a no-knock raid. So I believe there were, 26 shots fired into the home. She took multiple bullet wounds and was killed right where she lives. And this happened at about 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning, somewhere around there, in an apartment complex. So not only was her life in jeopardy, but a few bad shots fired, and who knows what could have happened to neighbors and everything else. Her boyfriend was in there, Kenneth Walker. There's a 911 call that they released, the recording of that. He basically says that Breonna's been shot. At that point, I think she's already passed away, because they asked him if she was responsive. He said no. He didn't know who was shooting at them. He ended up shooting back, injuring an officer who turned out to be okay. He didn't die or anything, but I think he was hit, I believe, in the shoulder or the arm. And that was that. So that kicked off the protests here. And we've seen that since, and of course that escalated with the killing of David McAtee. Barbecue owner in the West End. On the night of one of the protests, there was a mass gathering in the parking lot next to his business. And I don't know if you saw this, but the New York Times just put out a piece where they compiled all the audio that's available and all the video and ran it simultaneously so you could see the whole story of what took place. And basically, the police forced the crowd towards his establishment. A lot of them rushed into the establishment. During the confusion, they apparently didn't know what was going on. A pepper ball was fired inside the restaurant, at which point shots were returned. The police fired back. They switched from pepper balls to bullets, fired, I believe, 18 shots, hit David McAtee in the chest, and he basically fell down and died there on the spot. So I know some people are trying to put blame on him, but it is basically he was defending his restaurant and using his Second Amendment rights in the process of that. So we can debate his decision, but at the end of the day, the guy didn't know what was going on. There's multiple people rushing to his restaurant, police presence all over the place, and just chaos, and he feels like he was defending himself and the people around him. So it's just a tragic story all the way around, and so the country's fired up now. You're seeing just all over the country protests. There's a massive protest in Philadelphia today. I saw the video of that. I can't even count the number of people. But it's going on everywhere from DC, New York, LA, here, throughout the Midwest. And that's kind of where we're at now. I'll let you guys kind of jump in from here.
Mm-hmm. Vince, do you have any thoughts or observations about that?
Well, George Floyd was, what, a week ago? Breonna was a couple of months ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're stringing facts together that aren't necessarily in proper order or even relevant to each other.
Well,
And,
I just put them in that
it
order.
sounds like you didn't
Sorry, real
watch
quick.
the David McAtee video, because there's security footage from inside where nobody can say they didn't know what was going on, balderdash, and the guys all come running in because the police are coming up. He steps out to pop off a few caps, and somebody shot him because he's shooting at them. So I don't know where you're getting all this other stuff. The video doesn't show anything about anybody shooting anything into the restaurant, but
Yes, it does.
it's a narrative. Go ahead.
Well, again, as far as the order, just in the way the information came out. So not necessarily in how it happened, but that's the order the information came out.
The information was.
Go ahead.
I don't understand what that is. I mean, it seemed to me that what we're doing is latching on to anything and basically blaming the police.
Well, yes, because again, if you read the New York Times article, which I referenced in my statement, which you obviously haven't read, they took all the videos, put them together chronologically along with other audio that shows everything.
Slow down.
So
We've
if
got
you're arguing
how many
against what I'm
different
saying, you
cases
clearly haven't seen that.
Hey, guys, let's give each other a chance to talk and try to not make it personal, okay?
I mean,
which
it's
case
not
are you
personal,
talking
but
about?
I'm talking about David McAtee with the brand new New York Times article that they just ran.
Okay.
But, I mean, I'm not saying this is an insult. You obviously haven't seen that, which is fine. But what I'm saying is based on that, and you can clearly see the pepper ball being shot into the restaurant, and it lands right above David McAtee's niece's head, and you can see her duck back. All of this is in the video. I would definitely recommend everybody check that out because it's literally every angle put together.
And
so if you're saying that didn't
when
happen,
these guys are out there violating curfew and the police are coming up the street and shooting pepper balls and those guys run in the place, somebody standing in the doorway, you think that justifies shooting at the police?
I don't know if he knows that's the police or not. I don't know what he's thinking. We'll never know.
Did anybody
he's
not know
here.
that? This is Louisville, Kentucky.
You're
Did
assuming
anybody
a lot.
not know that?
I try not to assume things. You're
Well, but
assuming
you
a
told
lot.
us all
I'm not
about
gonna
how he
assume
was
what's on his
feeling. I think
mind.
there's a lot of
can't ask
assumptions
him.
there.
You can't ask him. He can't speak. But
you just did a monologue on what he felt.
Is what I think he probably felt. What I think, and I said that.
Okay. Well, then why would it be
he's
okay
at
for
his
you to make
restaurant
those
working.
assumptions, but not for me?
He's literally at his restaurant working. He can be seen
Rolf,
flipping meat.
I'm going to moderate here.
Okay.
Let's give Vince a chance to talk a little bit, and let's not cut in. Zoom doesn't allow a lot of interruption. Vince, why don't you share with us some of your observations about the facts, and also try to incorporate some of, maybe your bigger picture policy recommendations, or what people are doing wrong here, what people are not attending to or taking into account as you see it. Does that make sense?
Sure. And it seems to me that there's a kind of inflammatory response going on that really I think we all ought to condemn. And, there have been people killed by police lots of times, and the things that the police have to do are often very difficult. Most of us don't face those things. And there's some accountability here that we're not talking about, and we should. So if I'm upset that Rolf is shot, broke my window out, do I go beat up Hart Hagen or break his window out? The whole reaction makes no sense. And so if we want to run for office and and make arguments, and I think that's been effective over the years. I think people of all types have been successful in doing that. But I think we're just, I kind of doesn't make a lot of sense to say what was it somebody said on YouTube or on the news thing the other night, a few nights ago, that it's not that this was on NPR. It's not that the system is broken. It's that the system isn't broken and we need to break it. And I think that's a really bad, wrong attitude. I think we could back up a little bit and talk about the justice system, and there are problems, but in terms of accountability, if you want to talk about Breonna Taylor, there was a search warrant and it named Breonna Taylor and the two other guys that had associations with drug activity. Nobody's talking about Judge Mary Shaw. I mean, she's a fine lady, and nobody's talking about whether the warrant actually was a no-knock warrant, because I've looked at it. It was not. The affidavit asked for that, but the warrant doesn't say that. My guess is Judge Shaw didn't think that was necessary. In my experience, and I've worked in law enforcement, when the guys are getting ready to go in on a search warrant, they want shock and awe, overwhelming surprise, and all that kind of stuff. And so, in this case, it's my understanding that the lawyers for Breonna have even acknowledged that yes, they knocked, and the neighbors heard them knock. And I can't imagine the police going in the way that they're looking for surprise and not be yelling, "Police down!" The way you see it on TV. And so I'm hard pressed to believe, other than maybe not trying to wake the neighbors or something, that they didn't announce themselves. And whether they did or not, Breonna's boyfriend, he's taken by surprise, but I think from what I heard, you got the sequence wrong, Rolf. You said the police started shooting and then he started shooting back. Well, if you've got some inside story that shows that, I'd like to see it, because that's not what the news reported and that's not what the police say. You get trained to aim in on a potential felon and to quickly suppress everybody so that you can't have people getting hurt, people fighting back, and all that kind of stuff. But that's what we use the police for. They're the ones that are supposed to suppress evil, so to speak. So I realize there's some times that people get killed, people get wrongly. They've gone into houses over and over, and in fact, the 8th Circuit, Kansas City here, just months ago, said they don't have qualified immunity where they've exceeded the exigent circumstances that might justify a no-knock warrant. And so that's where you fix this stuff, holding judges accountable for the kinds of warrants that they sign, for the kinds of activities that they allow, and holding police accountable for performing what they've been ordered to do. And so, but, raging through the streets claiming that only Black Lives Matter and destroying other people's businesses is not the solution.
Okay, let's hear from Rolf.
Oh man, I don't even know where to start with that. I could talk for about 5 hours on everything there.
Well, why don't you talk about maybe the fact situation, maybe any aspect of the fact situation you think Vince may have wrong, or any aspect of policy that you think we should be thinking about.
Okay, you bring up the judge, but at the end of the day, it's the police that show up at the location and carry out whatever they're there to carry out. And they fired 20 plus bullets into an apartment complex blind. First of all,
why do you say blind?
Vince, let him talk. Let him talk.
First off, why would anybody anywhere be okay with that? That's just messed up. Second of all, it's an apartment complex. There are other people that live there. So any misdirected shot can go through a wall, kill a child in the neighboring room, but there's no regard for the people. You have to understand what the police are there for. They are not there to protect and serve the people. They are there to protect and serve the system and the 1% from the people, and their secondary duty is to generate income. That's what they do. So the system isn't broken. They're doing exactly what it is that they're supposed to do. We have to look at the hiring and training practices of the police. In Germany, there's a 2-year training program that's very comprehensive. Over here, we have a very short program. We need to teach these police how to deal with children, the elderly, people with PTSD and dementia and those types of conditions. We need to teach police how to de-escalate. We need to demilitarize these police. We need to take the duty of income generation away from the police. We're taxpayers. You don't need our money. Just quit trying to get our money. The whole thing is a mess. So I'll just stop right there for now.
Okay. Well, let me make an observation. I mean, you know, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. This is not an observation, it's more of an evaluation. If you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you've got a huge, like at the national level, international level, if you've got a big standing army, it's inevitable that you're going to have more war. If you're a militarized police force, it's inevitable that you're going to see things as a military situation and you're going to see the other people as the enemy. I am of the opinion that the police they're too heavily armed, and that's one problem. Too heavily armed. They're, you know, how much time do they spend shooting at a man-sized target versus training to de-escalate the situation? Another thing, it's hard for me to imagine that they had to shoot 26 bullets into an apartment, for one thing. And another big picture thing is, why are we busting people for drugs? I mean, the drug war
Right.
on an international level is a huge scam. There's a whole lot of white collar criminals that never get prosecuted in the drug war. It's primarily used against poor people, especially people of color. The drug war is just a huge sham. And, you know, to me, from a big picture standpoint, it's unconscionable, or it's unnecessary to be knocking on people's apartment after midnight, trying to, you know, hunt down drug offenders, heavily armed, to the point where you get triggered and you pump 26 bullets into somebody's apartment. Do you have, why don't you respond to that, Vince?
Well, you suggest that the police ought to be better trained in de-escalation. I think you can lay that at the feet of the mayor who makes the budget. And I agree with you that police deserve more training and ought to have more training. And I know I've been through some of that myself. It is very helpful. And I see maybe particularly young, but police officers dealing with situations that I know can be dealt with better. And on the other hand, I also see people doing all sorts of things that cause the police to be concerned, cause them to be afraid. Shooting at them is one of those things, and raging through the neighborhoods, destroying other people's property is another of those things. And I'd be interested to hear, Hart, how you propose to de-escalate what went on in the city in the last week or two here. What would a nice policeman come out and say that would fix that?
Well, the last week we had Jake Bush, who was you know, at the protest, and he's going to be on again tonight at 7 o'clock. The way he describes it, you have the police not really being able to handle peaceful protests, and they get in a military line and use a pincher movement and push people into 4th Street Live and provoke a bunch of stuff. And when the property damage starts, they're not arresting people for property damage. They're just standing there letting people damage property. And you know, they're not using the power that they have to arrest people for arrestable offenses. They're using the power that they have to provoke things. And even, Jake got arrested and he was not arrested for doing anything. He spent the night in jail, and it's not because he did anything.
Okay,
So,
I'm interested in hearing those kinds of stories, but
yeah.
I've personally organized maybe almost a dozen protests. I've personally been present for several dozen, and I didn't see people feel the need to go destroying things and screaming about their view is the only view and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I've dealt with this kind of stuff, and I've dealt with the police in dealing with this kind of stuff. I think you're missing an awful lot of stuff, and people have been shot by the police and in these kinds of raids for kind of a long time, and kind of a lot of them. And nothing is said about that. We don't have Hart and Rolf featuring this one and that one and this one and that one. Now, just because it spills over into the streets, this is a. We need that. What was it you said before the show? We wanted to take a 30,000 or 50,000 foot view of things. Well, character matters. Self-control matters. And when people are brought up to be able to protest under the First Amendment, and they do that without violence, then okay, then we can really jump on the police. But right now, I think the police are the ones on the defensive here. And we got people saying the police are the criminals. They're working for the capitalists, and they're evil. And come on, guys. No police officer I've ever known, dozens of them, ever went into the force thinking, I'm going to defend the big banks. And nobody's a bigger critic of that process than I am, Federal Reserve and the big banks.
Okay, so
I think we need to get some principles in place here. Truth matters. And the fact that there's a hyper-emotionalism about the whole thing, that matters too.
Okay,
so
a lot of things there. Go ahead, Art.
I went to the climate strike. I was one of the organizers of the climate strike on September 20th this past year, and it was insulting how much police force was there.
Why would you be insulted by the presence of police?
Let me continue. Why is it insulting? Because it's really hard for me to put my finger on it. It just seems like too much force for the situation. I don't see the reason for it. It's treating people like they're criminals before they've done anything. Why do you have cops on Clydesdales? Why do you have 100 cops out there for a protest with 500 people? It's just
because things like what happened in the last week or so happen.
Like what happened?
And we're going to blame them if they're not proactive and they aren't prepared to deal with it. We're going to blame them. And you're saying if they do show up and they are prepared, then that's bad too. Don't we have to pick one?
I don't know.
Well, I mean, this is one of those principles, the principle of non-contradiction. A thing either is or it isn't. So I think there's an awful lot of frustration maybe, but I think what's called for, the solution is calm discussion and reason and not contradicting ourselves, having an understanding, maybe even seeing it from the other guy's point of view. And that, with regard to George Floyd, is one of those problems. All the people I've seen raging about how evil the police are have never tried to subdue a man who was bigger than them and who, frankly, if you look at those videos, was giving them some resistance.
No, he wasn't. No, he was
okay.
not.
Well, we can disagree about the facts, but he didn't want them cuffing him. And when they got over to the car, and I wish there was more video, but in the fringes of it, it seems like they're trying to get him into a car and it's not working out. So he ends up on the ground. I've been handcuffed a number of times, and that's not where I end up. But then I don't try to wrestle away from the cops either. So, and when you got a guy down and he's a big guy, how do you deal with that? I mean, you know, I'm no giant. I might have to do things myself that I wouldn't do if this were a little old lady. So, you know, yes, there are problems, but I've heard a priest accuse the guy of intentional murder. And what's his name? You said the officer's name, David Slavin. I don't believe he intentionally tried to kill George Floyd. This doesn't make any sense. So I think those accusations aren't helpful. I think there's a judicial process that will work out those things, and we'll have witnesses come in under oath. That's why we have these processes. And I don't think trying these cases in the media is doing anybody any good. It's just flaming the emotions.
Okay, let's let Rolf respond.
Okay, well, he definitely was not resisting. Now, he did fall down when he was cuffed, which led to the whole thing, but he's being led by an officer while being cuffed. So, you know, if he trips, he trips. But that's not a reason for three people to jump on this dude and then put a knee on the neck for 7 minutes. There's only one thing that's going to happen from that, and that is death. That is strangulation. There are people there literally telling them to stop, and he's just like a shark eating fish, no expression on his face whatsoever. He doesn't stop. He wasn't going to stop. There's also the fact that these two worked at the same place together at a bar. So I don't know that while they couldn't confirm that they knew each other personally, the bar isn't that big. So I'd say they definitely run into each other. So I don't know if that contributed to this or what was going on, if they had a history. But
Yeah,
what was
either.
going on there was a murder, was an absolute murder. The people there in the crowd even said, check his pulse, and they did not.
Okay.
So I don't know what the argument is right there for the officer, but that's, you know, the guy's a murderer.
Well,
he should never see the light of day.
Nobody in the Louisville Metro Police Department was there. None of the guys in Louisville had their knees on George Floyd's neck.
That's
and
correct.
So this wholesale blame the police thing is unjust. It's not right to do that.
Well, it's been like this for decades, though, And people have quietly protested, and they spoke out, and it just gets ignored, and it happens, and it happens, and it happens, and it's continuing to happen.
In a law enforcement situation, sometimes people die. Rolf, you're
they shouldn't, though. That's the job.
Well, they shouldn't. That's right.
The job of law enforcement, if it was to be done correctly, is to protect and serve the people, which we know they don't do. The job is to make sure the citizen comes home safe.
So you want the police to apologize to school shooters and ask them if they need more ammunition?
That has nothing to do with anything. That's a reach. I'm
not
even going to justify.
One. Go.
Okay, so the reason this stuff is breaking out, and I've been to a whole lot of protests. I follow protests closely. I've watched, I can't even tell you how many live streams of protests all around the country, all over the world. It's a pattern in the way the police are trained. So it's not a Louisville thing or a Minneapolis thing. It's a systemic thing across the country. But what I can tell you is protesters go to protests to protest. They don't go to loot. They don't go to riot. Other people take advantage of this, but they can only do this if there's chaos. So where does the chaos come from? And that's when the police start cracking down. And you see it time and time again. They kettle people in, tear gas, pepper balls, charging people, all the tactics. And then chaos erupts, people flee, and lo and behold, now there's looting, now there's rioting. But there wasn't before when people were peacefully protesting. So I went to the protest Wednesday night, and I streamed it. It's on my Facebook page on Louisville Proactivist Report. I went Wednesday night down to 6th and Jefferson, turned into a march all through downtown, all through the Highlands and back. Almost a 4-hour march. There were no police anywhere around, and there was not one moment of violence. And if you don't believe me, you can check my video. But literally not one moment of violence. We did have one person try to run people over in the protest. I have video of that. He was stopped peacefully by the protesters. They stopped him. And everything went well, but there was nothing. People were even recycling their garbage and everything. It was a beautiful community feeling to the whole thing. But you remove the police, all of a sudden there's no tear gas, no kettling, no pepper balls, no charging tactics, none of that, and nothing happens. And look, there was no looting, no rioting. It's amazing how that happens. So we see it time and time again. There's video after video across the country of police beating people, leaving looters and rioters alone, but beating peaceful protesters, locking up peaceful protesters, yet buildings are burning. They're not locking those people up. This is an intentional tactic. I don't know why it is, but we're seeing it time and time again. So the blame needs to be where it is. And most, not all, but most of that blame does fall on the police. And this is systemic. So this isn't today. This isn't last week. This is decades and decades and decades. So it's time to change the system. It's time to take the profit out of incarceration. It's time to take the military out of the police and just reform the whole criminal justice system, because this is a mess. The people aren't going to take it anymore. And that's why people are in the streets protesting.
So this has nothing to do with George Floyd or Breonna Taylor. This has to do with changing the country, changing police and government operations.
Yeah, and I think there's a place for
All
that.
that broke the camel's back is basically what it is.
Okay.
So,
well,
Rolf,
I don't think you can blame the police because we live in a democracy, and I don't think you can blame the police because we have a free market, sort of. I don't even think you can blame the police because there are capitalists who exploit the laws and rules, and even higher than that, there are conspirators who organize to make money at the expense of everybody else, and I don't think any of that falls on the responsibility of the police. But go ahead.
Well, this whole thing kicked off specifically from the police with the George Floyd incident. That was literally a cop strangling a man to death with his knee. So none of this
that
happens
might be
without
true in
that
Minneapolis.
moment.
One at a time. One at a time.
But, because it's going on across the whole country. So it happened in Minneapolis. It happened in Louisville. It happened in Georgia. But hey, guess what? People are protesting in Philadelphia, in D.C., in New York, in L.A., in Denver. Name a city. They're all there.
What's your point, Rolf?
He keeps saying, well, you know, he keeps trying to say, well, we weren't in Minneapolis. Well, this is a whole nationwide thing. This is decade after decade of unarmed black men being killed, of protesters, you know, having these tactics used against protesters. So at what point, you know, if you keep doing this to us, you know, how are we supposed to take it? You know, we're just supposed to just take this stuff forever just because?
Okay, let me,
Who's us in that sentence?
I'm going to ask a question. Okay, here's what I want y'all to do. Anybody can go first. I think we're maybe talking past each other because are not agreeing on the issues to be resolved. Like, can one of you clearly state an issue, like the number one issue to be resolved, or, you know, a discrete finite issue to be resolved?
Well, I think the ball might be in my court after all this, but it seems to me that what Rolf is trying to say is that the police started shooting tear gas before anybody did any graffiti or looting or vandalism or any of that stuff. And frankly, I think we have a problem with the facts. I have never seen the police start shooting people with tear gas when there was no problem happening. Now, I've seen them do it when streets were being blocked, when they say, okay, we're going to clear the street. But on the other hand, I watched a couple of guys park their large, what do you call that, hipped up cars in the middle of the 6th Street in daylight, when they don't have any right to take over the street just because they want to do whatever it is they want to do. There are sidewalks. And the protests that I've been involved in have all been peaceful. And some of those issues are life and death. But we got a problem, I think, in assigning racism as the motive for so many people. And the first thing out of any of these mouths seems to be that the other side is racist. If I went around with a sign that said "White Lives Matter," everybody would accuse me of being racist. I don't know why there's an exemption for somebody who goes around saying Black Lives Matter. All lives matter. And when a politician recently said that very thing, why Twitter lit up like he had said, Black lives don't matter, and that's just not the case. And so there's hyper emotionalism and I think kind of some disingenuous stuff. What, Rolf, have you done to keep looters out of your protests? How do you do that? What do you do to keep people who are coming in from other organizations or coming in to do other things than what the protest is about? Do you work with the police? Do you do backgrounds on people? Do you keep up with who's actually involved? Any of those things?
Okay, well, I haven't come across that personally, so I can't say what have I done because that situation hasn't come up, so I've had no opportunity to deal with that one way or another. But that said, what would I do if I see somebody gearing up to cause violence and I know they're not there to protest? Then I'm going to point them out. When I'm at these protests, I'm streaming. I have an independent news page that I run, so I go and I stream. So I will get him on camera, just like I got that guy on camera that threatened to run over the protesters the other night on Wednesday. Got it all. So, I'm basically going to dox these people with my camera so everybody know who it is. I'm also going to call those people out, and if I need to physically refrain somebody, I might do that. It just depends on what's going on. But if I see one of these pallets of bricks placed out somewhere, then yeah, I'm going to be keeping an eye on that. Who's using that? We got to stop people from picking up bricks and throwing them. We got to stop people from spreading graffiti. You call them out, you stop them, you take their cans. You see people about to throw bricks through a window, you stop them, you take the bricks, you do what you got to do, because these people are not protesters. There are two groups out there. There are protesters and there are looters. The looters are infiltrating the protesters, but like I said earlier, they can't loot without chaos. So the key is to keep the chaos away. So that's what I would do.
Yeah, and I've done a little of that myself, and I think you better get some training before you try it, because you'll probably get pretty seriously hurt doing that. And that's why the police react the way they do. When they start seeing people loading up bricks and bottles, the things that they're going to be throwing. I mean, we've had several incidents of black youth, black adults beating people relentlessly, horrifically. A couple of guys with 2x4s. Where was that one? A couple of kids, young guy the other day killed 2 old people in the Veterans Cemetery. I mean, there are all these other incidents. Nobody wants to talk about them. This is very selective in our outrage, and I get the idea that it's selective out of convenience or agenda. We make a big deal about Breonna, we make a big deal about George Floyd, but we don't make a big deal about all kinds of other people who have died under similar circumstances if it doesn't suit our agenda. And this agenda of changing the police because we want them to be nicer, there's something to that, but getting people training to be able to de-escalate costs money. And, we spend our money on bike lanes and parks and not on police training. That's a shame. It's not the way it should be. We might be able to do both, but I also get the idea that we haven't really considered and ought to consider how we pay for these things. And, there's some utopian thinking, is that a word, that makes us think that the government just prints money and it comes from nowhere. We're witnessing this right now. But value gets transferred from somebody to somebody else. And frankly, one of the principles is we don't take stuff from other people. The proper role of government, that's an important high level issue to talk about, and the transfer of wealth from working people to all sorts of other people is what we call theft or an injustice, unless there's some principle that makes it right. And so I think there's a lot of this stuff that needs to be sliced and diced, and it's a much longer conversation for us to to get through all that. But at the moment, the one thing I think we can take away is that taking to the streets and blaming and creating this chaos and then blaming it on the police is not really a very helpful approach, it seems to me.
I'll just say you said a couple of times that we're very selective in the outrage, and that is true in society in general and with the mainstream media, but that's not true in a lot of segments. A lot of activists, a lot of independent media have been talking about these things forever. I'm in my 40s. I've been talking about these things since the 90s. We just met today, so there's no reason you should know that. But there are plenty of us not selectively picking one or another. Now we're here talking about this topic, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, because that's what's going on in society right now and the repercussions of which. But don't think all these other things are ignored. There are many, many of us speaking to this, and I just want to point that out.
Well, that's where Mayor Fisher ought to hear it. It's where not by burning down the neighborhood, but rather by a protest in front of his office, and getting him on camera to speak with people about these problems. And that would be the right approach. But rioting because of bad results when we didn't do anything about the problem in the first place is not really a solution to the problem. And that it doesn't even help for it to go away, because we burned up a lot of resources and we burned up a lot of emotional capital and relational capital, and probably have hardened the sides more than we've brought people together. And so it's a lot of work to get people together and have them talk. And as Hart, you well know right here. So
yeah.
I think that kind of proactive is far more helpful than trying to blame some young police officer because he didn't know what he was doing. And I'm giving I'm not applying that to the older ones, because most of them do know what they're doing. So anyway.
Well, it seems to me, Vince, that you have, I think that there's a difference between your perception and mine. I perceive that the police are over-militarized and are trained in conflict and trained to use force way more than they need to. I perceive that police are overfunded, and that they have to deal with things that they're not trained for, like homelessness or
remember that principle?
Or mental health.
Overfunded and not trained. Does that make sense, Hart? Come on.
Well, I'm telling you what I think.
I know, but we have to be rational. If we want them to be trained, it's going to take funding.
Okay, so let me address that. You're talking about how to pay for it. Now, one big picture thing that, the 50,000 foot level, you hear people say how to pay for it. So I have two words for that, and that is progressive taxation. And so, I used to be conservative, and I used to think that progressive taxation was theft. But what I didn't realize then is that there is a systematic upwards transfer of wealth, a systematic and large scale upwards transfer of wealth in our society, and that therefore a downwards transfer of wealth is justified. You have an upwards transfer of wealth through things like let me.
It's a whole nother show. I'm with you on that.
Give me a few minutes to just develop a point. So, the Pentagon is an upwards transfer of wealth. You have, arms contractors, and you have technology being developed through the Pentagon, and then that goes basically to enrich wealthy investors of companies like Facebook and Google and whoever uses that technology. So there's a lot of upwards transfer of wealth. There's also an imposed scarcity. We pay taxes for the Pentagon, for one thing. We pay more for healthcare than we would have to if there were a single payer system,
or a multiplayer system.
Yeah, so
free market.
So I'm just saying that. Well, I'm not a believer in a free market. There's no market without a state. The state is always a referee. to set the market
Well,
up.
but referee and cage keeper are two different things. It's one thing to want to have just laws and enforcement of reasonable contracts. It's a whole other thing to drive everybody out of business because we want a single payer.
Well, that to me, that's a type of scarcity that is contrived and is not real.
I agree with you.
No, if you want to know, I'm saying that free market theory, or even, no, you gotta let me develop. Continue. I'll let you talk if you let me talk. So, free market theory doesn't account for the fact that when McDonald's sells a hamburger, it costs a lot more than what they're charging you for it, because you have all these externalities. Externalities especially give big corporations the power. Externality is another word for shifting the costs onto the public. So big corporations have the power to impose costs on the public they have the power to extract money from labor. They have power to extract money from the environment. They have power to extract money from governments. And so the GDP is virtually meaningless. You have all this money floating around in the economy that doesn't mean anything. And to me, that there's a lot more scarcity that is imposed by those externalities than would be imposed by reasonable regulations. So I'm not buying the idea that there's not enough money to pay for the things that we need. To me, this is not just a slogan, but how I see the world. Gandhi said there's always enough for everyone's needs, but there's never enough for some men's greed. And I believe our economy and our society is structured so as to cater to that greed, and so that we don't have enough left over for people's needs. But I absolutely don't buy the idea that we don't have enough to pay for what's really needed. But I think we are spending a lot of money on things that we don't need.
And Martin Luther King said that he prayed for the day that his children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And I think when we focus on color of skin, we're making a mistake. We want to focus on teaching people how to get along, I think.
Yeah, there's that.
I'd like to address some of the money situation.
Okay.
First of all, when it comes to how do we pay for things, we have to differentiate between federal and then state and local, because federal is on the fiat currency and it's backed by nothing. So the Fed literally moves decimals on a computer and creates money that way, which is a lot different than how the state and local do it, where they're actually, on a legitimate budget. But we've watched them basically create trillions of dollars out of thin air here recently at the federal level. So when it comes to that, if we're pulling in money from state and local, yeah, we got to figure out where that money comes from. But federally, if that's where the money's coming from, then we have it and we're going to have it. As far as, you said that they're undertrained and overpaid or something like that, we can look at some of these cities and their budgets. For example, we can look at New York City. Most of their budget goes to the police department. It's over $5 billion. You look at Los Angeles, they have $3 billion budgeted for their police department. Chicago's $1.8 billion. When we watch the events that have been going on in New York, they've been trampling people with horses. They've been kettling people in, tear gassing, beating people, knocking people over.
Let him talk.
In Los Angeles,
we're all over the board, but I'm wondering how much time we have left.
We have probably a good solid 5 minutes left.
Okay, go ahead.
So, and in Los Angeles, we watched police officers in their cruisers aim for people and try to run them over. So when we see $5 billion and $3 billion respectively per year in the budget, that should be going toward training. There's no excuse to have that much money involved and to have these poor results when these police get out there and are dealing with people the way that they do. So those are massive budgets. Now, obviously, those are much, much bigger budgets than Louisville. And so we do got to figure out, where money comes from. But in general, just the money being there and funding them is not leading to better training, and we can see that in our big cities.
Vince?
Okay. Well, having not looked at the LMPD budget, I can't tell you what percentage they devote to training, and I certainly can't tell you anything about New York City. But I think the increase in training is a reasonable request. I think the entire department would support that. I think the mayor is the glitch in that process, maybe Metro Council. And I think if we want to, we've had dozens of issues here. We're all over the world, but if we wanted to focus on that, that actually might be helpful. And working on getting it funded locally, yeah, let's do it. So I think there can be some constructive work here, and I don't think anybody is going to be convinced when the sides harden that the other side has a point. And so we want to keep the conversation going, and we also want to maybe narrow the scope a little bit instead of trying to be the man behind the curtain, making the world a perfect place. Maybe it'd be good enough to solve maybe this one problem, training and de-escalation.
I don't think it's about making the world a perfect place. It is about having an actual democracy. And we've talked about how, Fisher is unresponsive and maybe the bottleneck or whatever. And, I would say my view, which I think is radical and also reasonable, is we don't have an actual democracy.
Because people don't care to vote?
No, let me finish. We have control by, concentrated capital runs the show. The government at the state, local, and federal level is like a puppet that is controlled by big money.
You say all this stuff, but I still go to the poll and vote, and other people vote, and elections have outcomes.
Yeah, let me respond to that then. I mean, no matter who you vote for, they're pro-war. No matter who you vote for, they're bought by the big banks, by big ag.
Man,
go on down the list.
And there are a lot of people who would be insulted to hear this.
Okay. Just because you have two choices for voting doesn't mean you have a meaningful choice. And that's where I'm coming from. That's why I say we don't have an actual democracy.
Well, I like independent candidates sometimes, so I agree with you on that.
Yeah, well, they're not, I guess we can take that up some other time. But we still have a few minutes left. Any final words of wisdom? Rolf, you go first, and then we'll go to Vince.
I'll let Vince go ahead and go first.
Okay.
I'm kind of pulling my thoughts together. So
yeah, me too.
I think that there are some statistics that ought to give us pause about who's actually engaging in what conduct, and I think we need to be careful about blame, and be careful about categorizing people, and be careful about broad wholesale statements about, everything is awful kind of stuff. And I think we need to bring it down a little bit from the 30 to 50,000 feet level, and get it more on the street where we can deal with things that we can actually wrap our heads around. I don't feel qualified to fix the world. I've given up being emperor, but I am able to do something, and I try that every day. So that's what I think we need: talk and work.
Okay.
All right. So with the police, we need them to be a part of the community. They need to be respected by the community. They need to respect the community, and we need to all work together. And the way that can't happen in the current state, but what can happen is we increase that training. We teach them how to deal with, elderly, with the young people, with people's dogs and their pets, how to treat people, PTSD, dementia, and other mental illnesses, and de-escalation and empathy. And when that happens and the police start acting in that way, they're going to gain the trust of the community back, which they don't really have right now. And they can actually police the way they were intended instead of the way it's been hijacked, kind of to protect the power. But we don't want to hate the police. We want to work with the police, but we need We need them to come to us. We need better training, and we need more empathy. And so that's
Well, they
what
don't
it
even know
boils
who
down
you
to.
are. Why would they come to you? What do you mean? What
Come
does
to
it
us,
come
the
to us? What
community,
does that mean?
to the community, to come to us, de-escalate.
They've been asking for training money for years. Okay.
Vince, this is Rolf's closing statement.
Yep.
I'm good. That's pretty much, I got my point out, so.
Okay, guys, we solved at least half the world's problems tonight. I sure appreciate, sure appreciate you joining me. And let's talk again soon. Thanks, Vince
Yeah,
Heiser
very
and
much
Rolf
enjoyed the
Freeth, for
conversation,
joining
guys.
me. Don't go
Yep.
away. Well, after we stop the recording, we'll talk. Thank you to our
Thanks,
audience.
guys.